If you ever tried learning French, whether in school or during your free time, you probably encountered the weirdness of French numbers. On one hand, you have 15, 16, but then 17. You have 80, literally 420, or 20 plus 20 plus 20 plus 20. You also have quatre-vingt-dix, 420 plus 10, or soixante-dix, 60 plus 10. Like, what's happening here? Something even more complex is the fact that some French varieties in different countries use different numbers. For example, in Belgium, soixante-dix does not exist, it's septante. But quatre-vingts is the same, while quatre-vingt-dix is nonante. This makes slightly more sense as it follows the same pattern as trente, 40, 50, and so on. Except that 80 still follows a different pattern. In Switzerland, quatre-vingts does not exist, and octante is used instead, which makes more sense. This can also be found in some Canadian French varieties, like Acadian French, and I want to emphasize here, this is not the case of Quebec French. So, what is going on here, and why do we have this weird number system in French? Let's first talk about Dix-sept. Regarding 15, 16, followed by Dix-sept, which is a different pattern, the explanation simply stems from language evolution from Latin to modern-day French. I actually made a video on this topic that you can check for further explanations. Basically, what happened is that number 10 to 18 in Latin followed a number plus 10 logic, which got translated into the numbers 11, 12, 13, up to 16. Starting from 20, the logic was different. We have the decimal base 20, 30, 40, and so on, plus the unit. However, the logic number plus 10 switched at 17, and if this logic continued the way it was, 16 and 17 would have sounded extremely similar, which would create confusion. People switched to Dix-sept to avoid that confusion, which follows the same logic as other numbers of having the 10 followed by the number rather than the number followed by 10. But check out my other video for a more in-depth explanation. Now, let's look at our friends soixante-dix, quatre-vingts, and quatre-vingt-dix. The main explanation for these odd numbers is simple, but its origin is still discussed. Let's start with quatre-vingts and quatre-vingt-dix, which follow the same logic. They use 20 as a base. This is because these numbers come from a vigesimal system, which means a system with a base of 20. A decimal system, which is what we see in English, or simply French in Switzerland, with septante, octante, nonante, etc., is a system with a base of 10. A decimal system is used with other Romance languages like Spanish or Italian, but it's not exactly the case with French. The Romans used the decimal system, and that's why in other Romance languages we can see it happen. But for French, there is a vigesimal system mixed with it. While this explains these odd numbers, the origins of the system are still discussed. I'll go back to this in a minute, but first I want to show you some changes that happened between Latin and modern French, and especially during Middle French, to understand how the use of a vigesimal system also led to soixante-dix. At first glance, soixante looks like it follows a decimal structure, just like the numbers before, like 40, 50. It may seem odd that soixante-dix is 60 plus 10, as 60 is not a base for counting in French. This is where Middle French comes in. In Middle French, numbers were a bit different than what they are today. We have 20, 20 et 10 for 30, deux-vingts 40, deux-vingts et 10 50, trois-vingts 60. And here, we can see the base 20 being applied. Now, French evolved to the numbers we know today. As such, soixante-dix was trois-vingts et 10, which switched to soixante, trois-vingts et 10. What's happening here is a clear example of two systems being used in the same language, decimal and vigesimal. But why was a vigesimal system used in the first place in French, while it wasn't the case in any other Romance languages? To be honest, the exact origin of a vigesimal system in French is not known for sure. There are some suggestions. First, it could be due to the origin of French beyond Latin, all the way to the Indo-European language family, which goes beyond Romance languages, and include languages like Hindi or Germanic languages as well. However, this explanation is not satisfying and enough because it doesn't answer why French is the only Romance language with this feature. Sure, it can be found in some other languages from the general Indo-European language family, but not in any that are more linguistically related to French. In other words, other Romance languages. Another suggestion, which is the main one found in France, it is due to Gaulish origin. Gaulish was the main language spoken in France before the Romans took over most of the country. Latin became the main language spoken, and some words of Gaulish remained, and maybe the underlying counting system as well, as the Gaulish use a vigesimal system too. However, while this is often used as the main answer for French people, who tend to be proud of this Gaulish heritage, there is nothing to truly attest that, although it sounds quite plausible. Finally, another explanation is that it comes from a Germanic origin, where such a system was used. Just like the Gaulish explanation, this one also comes from the influence of another language that was spoken in France at some point in time. However, this explanation also has limited proof to attest to that, especially since most Germanic languages, if not all, do not use a vigesimal system in their numbers today. By the way, did you know that the name France comes from a Germanic language and not a Romance one? This is because of the Franks, a Germanic tribe that invaded France centuries after the Roman invasion. As we can see here, the general idea is that French uses a mix of a decimal and vigesimal system. In this mix of systems, we may also be tempted to wonder why the mix happens the way it does. After all, why soixante but quatre-vingts? Why not trois-vingts and octante? It is hard to answer this question. Although a simple answer, and likely correct I would say, is that the bigger a number is, the less likely it is used, making it less common. As such, more common words use a more common system, based on the decimal system, while others tend to stick longer to a different system, the vigesimal system. What I find interesting here is that this mix of systems shows the unique evolution of French compared to other Romance languages, even though the actual origin of the use of a vigesimal system is still debated and uncertain. This leads to a mix of systems that make it unique. That being said, it is interesting to note that it's not the only language spoken in France that uses a mix of those two systems. Breton also does that. Breton, being a Celtic language, just like Gaulish was, makes it feel like the Gaulish origin could have more weight than the Germanic approach to explain the coexistence of two systems. I hope this explanation was good for you. If you come from a language that also has a weird number system, please let me know in the comments.